Hey, it's Ben Wilmore, and I'm going to show you how I dealt with a difficult shooting situation, both capturing it, merging multiple exposures together, and processing it using just Lightroom Classic. Before I dive in, I want to let you know I'm going to mention something special at the very end of the video that has to do with how to see some other free videos like this one that are not on YouTube. So be sure to watch all the way to the end there. But let's dive in and see what was involved with this image. Here's my end result. In this case, this is my wife Karen down here at the bottom. We are in Italy, and I love this little alleyway. Wanted to capture a shot of her. The problem is there is direct sunlight hitting this area up here and extending down into this little notch, and that's about it. The rest of this was in the shade, and the bottom portion where my wife is positioned was very dark. And let me show you the exposures I ended up capturing. Here is the darkest exposure. In the darkest exposure, I ended up capturing 3 total. I was only concerned with the brightest portion of the picture. And on my camera, I made sure that no area up in here had lost detail. I can do that in a couple different ways. I use a mirrorless camera, and I have something called zebra stripes turned on. And when that's the case, if something up here was losing detail, I would have seen it as a striped appearance. Or I could have reviewed a histogram, and notice on my histogram there's a gap on the far right. The gap doesn't need to be large, but I just need to make sure there's not a spike on the far right. That would have indicated there was an area of solid white, and I wanted to make sure I got the detail there. So I adjusted my exposure until I got that little gap, or the zebra stripes disappeared on my screen. Now, just getting that in order to get this detail, though, the problem is if I attempt to process this image, which I actually tried to do just for experiment's sake, this is what I ended up with. And in there, sure, I got detail in my highlights, and down here I can see my wife, but if I zoom up on her position, the color fidelity is pretty much gone. Look, she has green hair. Her pants are looking greenish, and there's a bunch of other issues primarily having to do with noise. And so I could somewhat recover this, and I pretty much gave up on it at this stage. I'm sure I could have taken it forward and done more with it. But for now, I'm going to hit the reset button to get back to our original exposure. So after capturing this shot, I then had my camera take another shot that was 2 stops brighter, and that ended up looking like this shot. And now with that shot up here at the top of the picture, it's starting to lose the detail. And if I hover my mouse over this area and I get, let's say, these numbers over here to be RGB numbers, which will be the default, I can see that this area where my mouse is currently positioned is completely white. If you look at the RGB numbers below the histogram, which was the subject of my last video on YouTube, you'll see they're all to 100, indicating we have as much light as we possibly could. And with this image, I experimented. I lowered the exposure to see if any color would appear in that area, any detail. I could get the tiniest bit of detail to appear, but there was no color. And therefore, it really wasn't usable to try to fix this image. This, though, down here at the bottom was brighter, and so I did attempt to process this picture as well, using just a single exposure, and this is how far I got. And with it, what I don't like is up here, there's really no color fidelity to this area. I can't tell what color that wall is. It doesn't quite look right to me. And if I were to zoom up down here at the bottom, we still got some kind of weird color going on with some hints of green and pink and other colors in here, just because as you get into the darker portion of a picture, it starts capturing less and less information. There just wasn't enough there. I'm going to hit the reset button so you see what it looked like straight out of camera. And let's go to my third and final exposure, which is this one. This one is again 2 stops brighter than the previous one. And now I'm really losing the detail up here, but I wasn't concerned with it because I captured that detail 2 exposures earlier. And so the main thing I'm trying to get here is what I see down here at the bottom of the photograph, get it to be as bright as is practical. Then I attempted processing this image, and here's what I ended up with. Notice I can get the bottom of the photograph to look good, and she doesn't have all those weird green residues going on, but now it's the bright portion of the image where I just can't get the color to show up, can't get it to look natural in that area. So let's reset that and show you what I did to get my end result, which is Let's see the first image here, this one. In order to get this image, I needed to merge all three exposures together into a single image, known as a high dynamic range or HDR image. But then I couldn't use standard processing with it. I had to do a lot more to get to this stage. So let's first look at the merging process and talk about it a little bit. Now my wife is doing a yoga pose here, and I can tell you she's not holding still. She doesn't know I'm shooting HDR, and she's trying to get in a better pose. And I'm sure she wants to get this foot to touch her head. That's usually her standard thing she tries to do when she's in a pose similar to this. So I know she's going to be moving. And therefore, she's going to be in a slightly different position between these three exposures. If I look at the three, starting with this one, and I just stare at where one of her feet is, like right here. Then I go to the next image, and the next image, I can see her foot moving. She's pulling it in a little closer to her body. Same thing with the foot on the right. Now, most of the time, that would be something you'd have to be concerned with if you're doing a multi-shot HDR image and you're going to merge it together. Because in that area, you can get ghosting. Where if more than one image has something in a different position, that you can see a little ghost where you see it in multiple positions at the same time. I'm actually not going to worry about that. Why? Because the motion in this particular image was only in the really dark portion of the image. The time I really have to be concerned with motion like what I just described is when it goes across the brightness range, where there's a bright and a dark area within that object. It's like a flag flapping in the wind and some light is catching it. So there's both shady areas in the flag and bright highlights in the flag. That's where it would have to blend multiple exposures together and you'd see ghosting. Or if you had water and the little waves in the water are moving around, well, those waves will have highlights on them where the sun catches it, and will have dark areas as well. When it tries to blend them together, you're going to get ghosting. On this image, I'm not, because the area where the motion is limited to the darkest area of the picture, and it's just going to use one exposure for that area anyway. So let's merge these together, and I'm not going to be as concerned with motion as you might think if you're used to doing HDR. So let's pop in here. I'm going to grab these three original exposures, and I'll go up here to the photo menu. I'm going to choose photo merge, and I'll choose HDR. Then when I'm in here, usually what I'd end up doing is I'd turn on auto align, because this was shot handheld. I wasn't using a tripod. I'm going to turn on auto settings just so I can see a relatively good view of the end result. I'm going to turn on show ghost overlay. That's where Lightroom thinks there's motion and where it's going to have to blend more than one exposure together to try to get rid of ghosting in that area. Now, most of the time, I would set this to high to begin with, and I would just see where does this color overlay appear. And in this case, this is in a much larger area than there was truly motion. There was a little motion on her foot or on leg right here and a little bit there. So I would then go to medium to see if that red overlay is more on a realistic area of the picture, although I would have hoped it was over here too because that leg was moving. And if I go to low, I get just her foot as if she's moving her toes. But for me, I'm actually going to set it to none. Why? Because this whole lower portion of the picture was really dark. There's no sun really getting into that spot. And so I don't think it needs to do that deghosting. And let's find out. We'll see if there's any artifacts around my wife's legs. So I'm going to come in here and hit merge. Before I do though, I'm going to turn off auto settings because I don't usually like to end up with the auto settings. I only have them turned on so I get a better preview of this. And now I'm going to hit merge. And that's going to merge those exposures together. I see my progress bar. I'll end up with a DNG file that contains that full brightness range. But I'm actually going to ignore that file because I've already done that. And I'm just going to go here to my end result. And we'll work on that version of the picture because I can always hit the reset button right here. And we're back to what it looked like right after I was done merging the HDR. The advantage here is I have some snapshots that will allow me to bring in some processing to this image that I did previously without you having to see me do it all. So first off, here's what the auto settings looked like. That's the equivalent to what we were looking at a few minutes ago. And then let's see how far I could take this image without using Lightroom Classic's masking features. If I just limit myself to what's found over here on the right side of the Develop module without getting up here into the tools. Well, that would be this choice right here. That's how far I was able to get it. And to do this, I was in the basic tab. I was moving things all over the place. I think I may have gone in here to the tone curve because I've maxed out some of those other settings and went into other areas. I just tried my best to try to optimize it. Well, the problem with that is when you're working with an HDR image like this one, if I move something like here, the highlight slider, well, I might need to bring that highlight slider down to darken the brightest part of the image, and I'm really thinking about this area up here. But I might be looking at that area when I'm bringing it down, but I might not realize it's also affecting those little highlights right down here. Watch them when I move my highlight slider. You see them getting darker as well. I don't want that area to get darker. So if I limit myself to using the basic sliders without getting into masking, I usually end up with a really generic looking picture as an end result. So let me show you what I did instead. Instead, I tried to, let me hit reset here so we go back to our original. What I did is I tried to not concentrate on the absolute brightest areas or the absolute darkest. And I looked at the image as a whole. And I tried to optimize it as best I could. I'm going to load in those settings right now, and this is the stage I got it to, where if I look at this general area of the image, the area that's not a bright highlight, that's not a dark shadow, I'm thinking it's starting to look okay. And I did that just by moving the sliders around. If you look and want to know in general what I was doing here, I brought contrast down. And contrast controls how big of a difference is there from bright and dark areas. As you lower it down, there's less of a difference. They look a little bit more similar. I also brought my exposure up because this generic area throughout here was looking a bit on the dark side. And with that, I also brought up vibrance and I adjusted my white balance. But around this stage, I started applying masking. And let me show you the steps that I did with masking. I'm not going to spend the time to actually reproduce it, but I'm going to tell you how each step was made, and we can look at the sliders to see the main changes that were happening. So let's go over here now and show you what it looked like in my end result, and let's click on the masking icon over here near the upper right so we can see all the masks that were used. It looks to me like there are about 10 masks because there's both mask 3 and mask 3 copy before it continues up. So 10 masks. Well, what I can do is show you the effect of the mask by turning on this little light switch. Just turn it off. You'll see what it looked like before masking. Turn it back on and see what it looked like after. Then the topmost mask was the last one that I created. And I'm going to go to each one of these and just choose hide. And all that's going to do is make it so it's disabled. It's not deleted, it's just not currently applying. And if I do that to all of these various masks, then we can turn them on one at a time and see what did I work on first, how did I create each mask, what adjustment did I put into each area, and that type of thing. So now we're down to the very first mask, mask 1. If I just click this eyeball icon and keep my mouse held down, you'll see what it looks like with it turned off. When I let go, you'll see the end result. That is simply adjusting the bottommost area of the picture. If you look at that mask, if I click over here on its little thumbnail, if I hover over it, the area covered with green is the area being changed. Your Lightroom might be set up to, instead of showing green, to show orange or some other color. You can click on this little square to change it. I just happen to have mine on green. That was used with the brush tool. All I had done is click up here where it says create new mask, and I told it to use a brush. And I had the feathering turned all the way up. And the main thing when you're painting with a feathered brush, a soft edge brush, is the larger your brush is, the softer the edge becomes. And therefore, I started with a huge brush, probably close to this size, and I painted across the bottom portion of the picture. And that gave me this really soft transition. I'm going to click on that particular mask, and over here on the right side, you can then see what I did to that area. You can see the first thing I did is I brought the exposure up just a little bit to brighten the bottom portion of the picture. But I wanted to concentrate that brightening on the dark areas. So I also brought up my shadow slider. Otherwise, this bright area on the far wall could have easily become too bright. Then I lowered contrast, and contrast controls how big of a difference is there between bright and dark areas. By lowering it, a bright area and a dark area became more similar in brightness, and that made it easier to see what was in here. Then I also made it a little bit cooler in this area by moving both temperature and tint just a little bit to the right. And that's because the sun was hitting this area here, which is kind of a warm light source. But the sun is not directly hitting down here. Instead, there's a blue sky above. And that light that's coming from the blue sky is partially illuminating this area, and that made this area look a little bit cooler. So therefore, this compensated for it. Then anytime I lower contrast, I usually need to compensate for it because that will make the image look a little bit dull. So I came down here and I boosted clarity to do so. So if I hide this layer by clicking on its eyeball, there's the before, and you can see it's a little bit on the cool side, and you'd like to be able to see a little bit more shadow detail. Afterwards, now I'm not mining that area. So then the next mask that I did was another one that I used just with the brush tool. It's this one up here. If I'll click on it and I'm going to turn it back on, and if I hover over it, you can see that that is me using a soft edge brush once again, and this time just painting on the entire upper portion of the image so I can work on that separately. And if I look on the right side of my screen, you can see the adjustment sliders that were applied. The main thing that was done here is the highlight slider was brought all the way down as far as it could go to try to get the brightest portion of the image darker. If I bring that back up, you can see how much brighter the highlights were. Well, that brought them down. It still wasn't enough though. So I also brought my exposure down a little bit just to get it so it was started to get close to the brightness I wanted. And then I also brought up clarity. Clarity makes the detail pop out a little bit. And I made that upper portion a little bit more colorful to make it look good with everything else. If I turn off the eyeball for this adjustment, you'll see before, and you can see how much we really needed to darken that bright area. But when I darkened it, the reason I used the highlight slider instead of the exposure slider is because this adjustment is applying to this whole upper area up here. If I did the exposure for that whole area, then this wall here would get way too dark. I wanted to concentrate it on the brightest areas, so I brought my highlights down. And when I brought exposure down, it helped out in that really bright area, but it also got into these areas here. Then I still didn't like this little sliver of the image down into this little triangular area. So there's where I concentrated next with this mask. And if I end up enabling that mask and I hover over it, you'll see the area that it's affecting. Now, in order to make that mask, I used the brush tool once again. In this time, I turn on this little check mark over here called Auto Mask. When you have Auto Mask turned on, you see a little crosshair in the center of your brush. And Lightroom will be looking at what color is underneath that crosshair. When you click, it's going to try to limit the change you're making only to things similar to what's underneath the crosshair. Well, if I disable this adjustment, you see how bright that area was in the photo. It was so much brighter than the rest of the image that Auto Mask did not have that bad of a time isolating that area. I just clicked, let's say, about here to begin with. That isolated a large portion of the top portion. I came down, I probably clicked about here on this other brighter portion to get the medium area, and probably came down about here to get the lower area. Each time being careful that the crosshair for my brush was on something relatively bright, since if it was on these dark shutters or the ones down here, it could have easily extended into too wide of the image. Now, after I'd done that though, the dark portions of this lamp that were right here and the dark portions in here were not part of my mask. So I turned auto mask off. I switched to a harder edged brush, and I painted over those little areas that were missing from what I was working on. And that's one area where I could improve my end result. If I come in here and look, you can see right where the edge of my brush stopped, right there. And that's because I didn't paint all the way across that little signpost. So that's something where I should further refine this. But had I not added that area, then the transition between the bright area that I'm darkening and that lamp, it would have been obvious. You'd be able to see the edge very easily. So that's how I isolated that particular area. Then even after doing that, I still wanted this area up here to look different. And so I did yet another mask, which is this one. I'll enable it, and if you watch the top portion of the photo, you'll see it finally gets just the right brightness for my eye. And I did that using, again, the brush tool. I painted in this area, and if you look at the name of this, it's called Mask 3 Copy. Well, all you got to do to copy an existing mask is to click on these three little dots here and choose Duplicate. And that's what I did to this mask that's below that had that entire upper area isolated. Then after I duplicated it, you can come in here, and if you hold down the Option key in a Mac, Alt in Windows, this bottom part changes to intersect. I clicked on that. And that made it so I may have started with this whole area isolated, but when I use intersect, I can say only give me a certain portion of that. And so I painted, and if you look right now at the green overlay, that's where I painted. To say I only want this upper portion of that mask. And that ended up delivering it. So with that area isolated, all I did was bring the exposure down a very small amount to bring the littlest bit of additional detail into that spot. I also brought up clarity a little bit to pull a little bit of the detail out, and I increased saturation just a little. And I also made it the tiniest bit more yellow. And if you want to see the before and after, I'll click on this eyeball. There's before. You can see it's just a little bit too light to my eye, whereas afterwards is just right. So then at this point, I wasn't minding the image as a whole, and I started to think about just refining areas that were not critical. And the main thing I thought about is the left side of the photograph felt like it was colorful and bright, but the right part of the photograph, at least the first half, the nearest portion right here, felt a little dull compared to what was across the street or even just further down the street. So the next thing I did is I made this mask, which I'll turn on. So watch the right side of the image. You'll see it change. You see it brighten up and get a little more colorful. All that is again me using the brush tool, soft edge brush, and I painted over this area. When I was done painting over the area, what you can do is if you hold down the Option key, Alt in Windows, and you just keep it held down, it's the equivalent to choosing erase over here and just choosing it temporarily. So I did that, and I lowered the feather setting. So I had a brush that wasn't that soft of an edge, and I painted over in here to any areas where I got overspray beyond the edge of these buildings. And in the end, this is what I ended up with. Now, if you look at the adjustment that I applied to that area, I wanted to brighten it. And I could brighten it in many different ways, like bringing up exposure or shadows, but I decided to bring up the whites. The whites starts by thinking about the brightest portion of the picture and makes that brightest portion even brighter. But remember, I was only working on this area over here on the right side, and we ended up brightening it up in that way. I also brought up clarity just a smidgen to make the detail pop out just a little bit. And therefore, that's what this is doing to the image. Then at this point, I thought I could be finishing up soon, so I wanted to go down and work on the area where my wife was positioned. And if I go to the next mask that's here and I enable it, watch what happens to her face. You notice it brightens up and it becomes easier to see the detail that's there. Well, let's zoom up down there. And when I worked on the overall lower portion of the image, I did that with this mask down here. If I click on it, notice that this setting called clarity is turned up. Well, whenever you bring up clarity on someone's face, they're going to look older Every little wrinkle and fold and everything else is going to be emphasized. Watch what happens here if I bring up clarity. Do you see how much more contrast is put into here? And you can see like every little vein and everything else in the skin. I'll choose undo. That's when I was working on the lowest portion of the image. Clarity got pushed up. I wanted to compensate for that. So when I got down here, I isolated Karen's face. And I did it just with the brush tool. I didn't do that precise of a mask because if you look at it, I have overspray onto the brick, the cobblestone street that's there, and a little bit onto her hair. But I don't think it would actually matter because of the type of adjustment I was applying. So in there, what I ended up doing is I moved clarity into a negative number and I moved it just about as far as the positive amount that was being applied to the lower portion of the image. Remember, I think it was at 24? Well, here, I've removed all but one of that so that her face is going more back to normal here. I also wanted to brighten up her face a little because it just felt a little dark. She was in a little bit more shady with her shoulders the way they were. And so I brought up the whites, which brighten things up. And I also brought down contrast, which gives you a little bit less of a difference between bright and dark. And also, whenever Karen's doing any kind of a handstand of any kind, I find that her face ends up getting a little red because all the blood starts rushing to her face. So after isolating that area, I took this area called hue and I shifted it towards the right a little bit. And what that did is it took areas that used to be red and it made them a little bit more yellowish. And that helped with my wife's face color. If I hide this adjustment by clicking on the eyeball, you can see before how her face looked rather red. And then afterwards, you can see how it's been brightened up and the color's been adjusted a bit. I could have done a little better there if I spent a little more time, but I thought that was good enough for how small her face is in the shot. Then I just continued to refine the image until I was happy with it. And so let's turn on this next adjustment. And if I remember correctly, what this was is there's an area in the back wall that I didn't like. Do you see the small triangular area? This little notch right here that looks to be brighter than the other things in its surroundings? Well, I isolated that. So that's what this adjustment does. Let's turn it on and you can watch that area change as I do. There we go. And to create that, I just used the brush tool. I used the setting called Auto Mask. And with Auto Mask, I had that crosshair in the center of my brush. I got a relatively small brush so I wouldn't get a lot of overspray, and I made sure the crosshair was on the bright area. I clicked a couple times in those bright areas, and then I took away from my brushing by holding the Option key, Alt and Windows, which takes away, and I just painted up here where the effect extended a little too far up. But in the end, that's the area that I isolated, and let's look at the adjustment sliders that were applied. All it was bringing the highlights down. If I bring it back up, you can see how bright it used to be, and I just brought that down until the brightness of that area was more similar to the rest of the surroundings. The other thing that I would possibly need to do is adjust the saturation a little bit to make it a little bit more or less colorful to also make that look more like the surroundings, but I don't believe I did that. Then at this stage, I'm just refining things more, and I noticed that on the left side of the photograph, this area right in here feels different than the area next door to it. So if I hover over and turn on this next adjustment, watch what happens on the left side of the picture. Do you see how it just changed a little bit? Well, that was me isolating this whole wall that's over here on the left, and all I ended up doing to it was making the saturation the littlest bit more saturated, almost unperceivably so, and I made it a little bit less yellow. If I turn this off, you might get a better sense that that feels a little bit overly yellow, although you might not mind that warm feeling, and afterwards I just toned it down. Then we have a teeny bit left. There is an area right up in here I ended up adjusting. If I click on this next one and turn it on, watch the left side of the photograph as I turn this on. And that ended up adding some contrast. If I hover over it, it's mainly that upper left. And if I disable it, you'll see that the dark portions of what there don't feel as dark as the lower portion of the picture. Look at the brown vertical pipe that is going up the wall. And notice about just over halfway up the wall, it gets a little bit brighter as you get right into about here. And the same is true for many of these shutters. And so I ended up isolating that area, and all I did to it was I brought up something called dehaze. Dehaze is very similar to bringing the black slider and moving it to the left. It works on the darkest portion of the picture, and it makes it even darker. And so that added a little of that contrast back. Then at this point, I was pretty much thought I was done. And there was one last thing after I came and went away from this image for a little while and came back. My eye just paid a little bit of attention right here where it felt like it was a little glowy, a little bit darkish of a glow here. And so I think that's what this last adjustment was. If I remember, let's turn that on, watch that area, and you see it brightened up just a little bit. And that's me using the brush tool to isolate the area with a soft brush. When I was doing that, I was just trying to define the bottom and left edge, this kind of edge through here. And then after painting there, I said, let's subtract from where I'd painted, and let's subtract using a brush. And I took away this top portion. I did that using the setting called Auto Mask, just this checkbox over on the right. And therefore, I could take away this bright area, that bright area, and therefore only end up with this area down here, which is this. And what did I do there? Well, all I did was bring the whites up. And not just the whites up. I did a teeny bit more. I did make it a teeny bit more yellow in color. And I ended up bringing the saturation up to make it a little bit more colorful and just a little bit less clarity. So if you want to see before and after, I'll turn off the eyeball. There's before where it just felt like there's a little shadiness in there that didn't belong. And afterwards, it's a little brighter, it's a little more yellow, and it's a little bit more colorful. And that's what I did with all of these masks, 10 masks total. If I turn off all the masks, here's what it looked like before masking. Here's what it looked like after masking. And if I were to let this sit for a day and come back to it, I'm sure I would find other things I'd like to tweak about it. But at this point, it's one of those things where it's kind of what I would call good enough for Instagram, where it might not be good enough to make a very large print of, but I'm fine putting that out to the general public. So now that you've seen the story for how this image came together, let's talk about how you can see some free videos. Not just some, a boatload of free videos coming up. They're not going to be on YouTube though, so you're going to need to go in the description below where you're going to find a special link to register. Registering is free, and this is where there's going to be 20 instructors. In fact, let me show you who's going to show up. We're going to have this amazing group of instructors. I've done this before every time I've enjoyed it, and each instructor usually presents 2 different classes, and you can watch those classes for free during these dates, May 2nd through May 6th. There's also the option to purchase, and if you did that, you'd be able to watch them beyond the dates of this actual event. But use the link in the description below to get your free sign up so you can participate. I'm Ben Wilmore, and I'll see you next time.